It's taken me years to shake off the emotional disappointment and sheer frustration that the ending of Game of Thrones inflicted upon my humble person. I consider it to be one of the greatest of atrocities ever committed in the realm of TV show fandom. To take a source material which shines through with its clever complexity, delivering an engaging plot filled with deep and complex characters, and reduce it to a boring, unimaginative, predictable, and even at times cheap spectacle is just an insult to the storytelling art. The showrunners took the rich, dense, and complex story of A Song of Ice and Fire, chopped it up, and cut it until they delivered a rushed, butchered mess of a final few seasons, where character arcs and proper plot resolution were set aside in favor of grandiose spectacle and simple fan service. The whole experience left a bitter taste in my mouth. See, I love the original books and consider them to be a brilliant and iconic work of contemporary fiction, a piece of literature which will one day in the future be deservedly lauded as one of the all-time classics, similar to how, for example, Lord of the Rings is still held in high esteem. So when House of the Dragon the show was announced, me, still held in the grip of bitterness, outright refused to watch it. I was boycotting any HBO product set in the Song of Ice and Fire universe in silent protest. I simply felt like when what they did with GOT was an injustice that could not be forgiven. More so, why would I invest in watching a prequel show when you fumbled the bag on actually portraying and bringing to a close the grand saga itself? How can I ever be satisfied with the crumbs HBO is trying to sell to me in a pathetic attempt to capitalize still on the original show's success and name recognition when you did the story and so many of my favorite characters such an injustice? It took me a while to get over myself. But as they say, time heals all wounds, so eventually, after hearing positive things about House of the Dragon, both online and from word of mouth, I decided to give it a chance, not having really anything better to do over the summer. So, one big question stands. Does House of the Dragon manage to rectify the mistakes of the final seasons of GOT? Does it manage to wash away the shameful stain they left behind? The obvious answer to this question is no. Nothing could ever achieve that. But this should not necessarily stand in the way of us enjoying and appreciating the show as it is, for all its good bits and all its faults. So here I am, trying to objectively put aside all my emotional baggage and give an overview of House of the Dragon, highlighting its specific positives and its negatives to assess the show on its merits and give a final diagnosis. Is it worth watching? So right off the bat, we can point to some of the positives working in the show's favor. The production quality is spot on, reflecting the masterful world building that the earlier GOT seasons pulled off through sets, set pieces, a variety of filming locations, and costumes. The show manages to bring the world of Ice and Fire to life, and it's obvious the showrunners have put in a lot of care and effort to do so. But House of the Dragon also manages to capitalize on some of the few positives of the later seasons of GOT, in that it does not shy away from grand spectacle. Action scenes and big battles are exciting, engaging, and provide a feast for the senses. The special effects are on point. The show manages to be exciting and gripping when trying to pull off action, and that definitely makes it a fun watch. Another point related to the above, and something I can applaud the show for, even though it might seem trivial, is that I really like the different dragons and their unique and distinct designs. Seeing as how the show is set during the Dance of Dragons and highlights the reign of the House Targaryen dynasty, the dragons represent a very important element. They are the reasons why the Targaryens managed to retain power over the Seven Kingdoms for so long and represent a key element of the lore, both as it relates to the Targaryen reign and the overall world. More so, each dragon has a unique bond to its rider, so the dragons are in a way an extension of that individual character. Caraxes specifically can be pointed to as an example. His design is unique, carrying sort of a sinister and ruthless edge, which complements Daemon perfectly. Somehow, the showrunners managed in a very creative manner to pull that off. Every dragon is unique, and I really like that fact. I think it enriches the lore, and it thus not only contributes to the show's quality, but the lore of the world of Ice and Fire itself, which is a hell of an achievement. Another point in the show's favor, especially as it relates to the first season, is that the show takes its time and puts in the effort to show you life at court and courtly intrigues. They really go out of their way to represent on screen how the kingdom is ruled and what the demands of a life at court as a royal really are like. George R. R. Martin is notoriously a huge history buff and manages to, thanks to that, insert a level of medieval realism in the story, which helps ground it, the more fantastical elements of it. The realism of the story benefits his characters, who come off as real people living in a real lived-in world. Thanks to that, anytime something more fantastical occurs, the reactions of the characters feel realistic. The dramatic stakes of the story are greatly benefited because the characters are more relatable thanks to their realism, and every time the fantastical is inserted in the story, it does not feel goofy, overblown, or over the top, but is instead something you can buy into. House of the Dragon does a good job of maintaining this sense of realism by showing you the small council meetings, for example, where the real politics of how the realm should be ruled are decided, bringing forth the diverse and large cast of main and secondary characters involved in the decision-making. This really serves to portray the complex nature of this medieval kingdom court to life. I also really enjoy the tourney portrayed in some of the earlier episodes, where we see knights jousting, the king spectating with his whole court, princesses and maidens granting their favor to favored knights. It all serves to provide a type of medieval realism which in turn then greatly benefits the dramatic stakes when the whole realm falls apart and the Civil War begins. This tone keeps true with George R. R. Martin's original vision, and I can't help but consider it a huge benefit. It's that sense of realism that was surely missing from the later seasons of Game of Thrones, when the show became an over-the-top action show more than anything. But even in the earlier seasons, you can say that such attention to these details wasn't as prevalent, so this is definitely a point in favor for the overall quality of House of the Dragon. Another point in the show's favor is that for the most part, so far, it's managed to avoid what eventually became such a prevalent and detrimental element to the later Game of Thrones seasons: sex and blood. While the GOT show was always mature, reflecting the tone of the source material, the thing about early Game of Thrones and the Song of Ice and Fire books is that the blood and the sex were elements serving to benefit the gritty realism of the world. They were by no means blatant and tasteless. The blood and the sex had a narrative purpose, serving to benefit character development or to highlight the horrific nature of war. They were used to highlight broader themes in the plot. This complexity was lost in the later seasons in Game of Thrones, where violence and sex became self-serving, instead being used to convey sort of a cheap, cool factor. There is a saying I really like, which I think really applies to this context, which is that spices are used to enrich the flavor of a meal, but if you put too much of them in, they become overpowering, instead overpowering the flavor of the meal and ruining it. Sex and violence should be used sparingly and tastefully, serving a broader narrative purpose of highlighting the realism of the setting and not in a self-serving and cheap manner. Though still including some of the uglier elements common to the Song of Ice and Fire setting, like incest, House of the Dragon manages to largely avoid this pitfall, The incest in the show is used to further develop both Daemon and Rhaenyra, meaning it was used appropriately as a narrative device, and thus necessary though unsavory and unpleasant to look at. Sex and violence are still a part of the show, but for the most part they have served a purpose and have not been overpowering to the tone of the show. House of the Dragon is still a far cry away from the action-packed and cheesy, violence and sex-rich tone of the later seasons of GOT. So far, we've been listing some of the positives, but unfortunately time has come to tackle some of the negatives. While being an imaginative and creative enterprise that has managed to pull off world building and a realistic tone well, House of the Dragon unfortunately falters where perhaps it counts the most. Character development. Character development in the show leaves much to be desired. See, the thing about George R.R. Martin's writing is that, above all else, he manages to put forth a cast of complex and very rich characters. His protagonists are relatable and are a far cry from being one-dimensional. They are likable, they have likable qualities, and those likable qualities stand out, but they also have flaws, which make them relatable and endearing to the audience. We are invested in their journeys of character development. His villains are no less complex. Though we denounce their actions, we are often given relatable and understandable motivations, making them complex in their own right and no less engaging. And even when George R.R. Martin decides to pull off one-dimensional, irredeemable evil in some of his characters, it's done sparingly, and he manages to make it so impactful by grounding it in the gritty and dark realism of the world that we just can't help but love to hate them. I believe that the reason behind the massive success and critical acclaim of the earlier seasons of GOT is the fact that it sticks to the source material closely in bringing these characters to life. In a sense, it wasn't a hard task, considering that you have the narrative structure and plot from the books to draw from. You can rest on George R.R. Martin's colossal shoulders and follow the same beats in the story progression to highlight the complexity of the characters and to bring the audience along on their individual journeys of character progression. In contrast, later seasons saw character motivations be reduced to shallow and superficial echoes of their former complexity. Character arcs were cut short and were underdeveloped. Character progression was not given time to properly develop, and the whole thing became a cheap imitation of its former greatness. The issue with House of the Dragon is that it runs in a similar vein. Instead of a complex story carefully laid out in hundreds of pages, the source material for House of the Dragon is a 20 to 30 page section in a novel which reads far more like an encyclopedia than a personal character-driven story. The showrunners have the events of the Dance of Dragons laid out and are given a bare-bones structure to follow, but they have to go out of their way to fill these oh-so-important and pivotal holes of characterization, defining character motivations, and providing satisfying arcs. We know when and what a certain character does in the context of the broader story of the Civil War, but as to why and how a character ends up in a certain place, referencing his or her internal motivations and character development, possibly the most important questions, there we have a void that the showrunners have to shoehorn in and somehow fit to the skeleton structure of events that unfold as it's laid out in the Fire and Blood novel. As a result, the show is lacking in the character development department. Characters often feel like they do things because the plot demands it, not because they want it in any sense, because it's coherent to their internal personal motivations. Things happen, and it feels like characters have to be put in certain places and situations to fulfill a certain role because the plot demands it, and not because the story is unfolding in an organic manner corresponding to their individual arcs. I mean, ask yourselves, why does Rhaenyra want the throne so much? The impetus for the entire civil war is that she believes she is the rightful ruler per her father's will, leading her to fight back against Aegon's ascension to the throne. But she was portrayed as having always wanted the throne and being bitter about the fact that the customs of the realm favor male succession even when she was very young. But why does she actually want the throne? Is it personal ambition? Is she a Littlefinger type character who is just power hungry? Is she noble, a dutiful person trying to do what is right and what she believes to be her duty in the interest of the realm, like, for example, Stannis Baratheon? Or is she overcompensating for childhood trauma while being guided by a somewhat naive moral compass, leading her to believe that through her rule she could be an agent of good, like Daenerys Targaryen? What is her motivation for wanting the throne so bad that she is willing to plunge the realm into a civil war leading to the loss of millions of lives? Her love for her father, is that her motivation? From what I saw, they had somewhat of a strained relationship, so that doesn't really fit either. See, this is a pretty important thing. For us to care about the war, it needs to be grounded in the motivations of our main characters. To justify the bloodshed of a massive war to the audience and make us root for her to win this war, her motivations need to be strong and specific. This is sorely missing from the plot of the show. Without strong main character motivations, there is nothing to make her relatable. Without her being relatable, there is nothing to ground the main conflict in the show in an emotional connection to the main character, and thus the dramatic stakes of the conflict itself are diminished. We don't care about what happens because we don't care about why it's happening, because we don't care about the main protagonist, because we don't know what that main protagonist wants and why she is doing what she's doing. And this is a common criticism that can be levied at most of the characters. Is Daemon a good guy or a bad guy? I get that he's supposed to be complex and an anti-hero, but fundamental elements to his personality are missing and are underdeveloped. Did he actually love his brother, the king? Why did he always want the throne? Is it just a power-hungry impulse and nothing more? Nothing deeper? No sense of inferiority inherited from being the second son and thus always being in the shadow of his older brother, for example? Nothing to make him more of a relatable character, nothing to make him feel like a real person? What about Alicent? We get that she's faithful and follows her father's will to a T, which is why she ended up where she did, but why? Was it fear that drove her to be such a compliant pawn on the political chessboard? And why did she all of a sudden become so dead set on making Aegon king in the span of a couple of seconds? Again, making her a key reason as to why this bloody civil war even began. Is it her love for her children that motivated her? Or did the story simply need for this to happen because it's the Dance of Dragons and a civil war is just what is supposed to happen? What about Aegon himself? He never wanted to be king, or did he? He's not even an agent in his own story. We don't even get to see how he grapples with the whole idea that his mother and his grandfather are dead set on making him king, not even considering his wishes. We never get a more intimate, character-driven moment to show us what he thinks of that and how he's dealing with it, and as a result, he just comes off as a placeholder, pseudo-villain, as someone who was inserted into the story to do what the plot demands of him, to take the throne and hold it so that Rhaenyra has someone to fight against. It was written in the Fire and Blood books that he was crowned king, so that's what was supposed to happen, and that's what happens. But he, as a character, is empty. He comes off as a simple placeholder doing what the plot demands. Why does Otto Hightower want his grandson to be king so bad that he sold off his only daughter to the king many years her senior? Is he simply power hungry too? I guess we will never know. What's Kristen Cole's deal? One moment he's loyal to Rhaenyra, the next one he hates her, next he's Alicent's most loyal supporter. Why? that's a pretty significant leap of motivation for it to not be developed. As a result, he just comes off as kind of a tool, so the audience just dislikes him. I can go on and on with example after example in the same vein. Ironically, the only two characters that you can point to as having a bit more complexity or an actual defined motivation are Viserys and Larys the Club-Footed. Viserys comes off as a complex man with his own issues, but also as someone who was torn on all sides by his various duties. He tries to do what was right as king for the realm, but he also was driven by a loyalty to his daughter and his deceased wife, and the cost of that conflict was portrayed in a satisfying way. You really got the sense that this conflict tore at him, and he had a hard time dealing with it. He was constantly struggling with whether he was doing the right thing and suffered because of that. He came off as a good guy trying to do the right thing, but not always being sure what that right thing was. That made him endearing and someone who could garner compassion from the viewing audience. It's really a shame that someone who, for all intents and purposes, was not the main character of the story, was the one to receive somewhat of a complex characterization, when his role in the story is to set up the main conflict through his actions and through his eventual death, rather than being the focal point of the main conflict and its resolution. Larys is by no means too complex of a character, but at least you get a moment in which he explains and pontificates on his own disability and how people's dismissive behavior of him due to this disability is what drove him to become this megalomaniacal, power-hungry worm, just as an FU to everybody who looked down on him. And even that is just one scene in an entire 2-season run for what is, for all intents and purposes, a secondary character. Needless to say, the show suffers tremendously because of this lack of characterization. The dramatic weight behind the events that unfold is simply not there because we don't care about the characters and their motivations. We want to see the war unfold, to see all the cool battles and how the various characters are going to end up dying, but that's cheap and superficial engagement. The show simply does not garner a deeper emotional investment from the audience because of this issue with characterization. In that way, it's very similar to the later seasons of GOT, where characterization became secondary and the show became more about action, big set pieces, and shallow, underwhelming, and unsatisfying rushed resolutions to character arcs. It is, unfortunately, what stands in the way of House of the Dragon being in the same category as the earlier seasons of GOT. It doesn't hold a candle to the sheer brilliance of George Martin's writing. It simply doesn't tap into the same depth and complexity. As a result, we get a passable, fun show to watch, but by no means something groundbreaking or impactful. It's fine. It's not as bad as the final seasons of Game of Thrones, and it has some interesting elements to it, but it's lacking the emotional depth to really grip the audience and make it must-see TV. In conclusion, House of the Dragon is watchable, but not superb. It's a long way from redeeming the name of the GOT HBO universe after the fall of the later seasons of Game of Thrones. I'm still gonna watch it and have a relatively good time doing it, but unfortunately it seems I'm going to have to live with the bitterness of being robbed of the brilliance of George R.R. Martin's writing being portrayed on screen properly, lingering after the end of GOT. At least until the Dunk and Egg show comes out, maybe. But that is a different topic for a different time. Until then, thanks for watching, and if you like this video, please give a subscribe. And remember,
dreams didn't make us kings. Dragons did.